In this case study, we will explore design concepts with this large Yamadori Rocky Mountain juniper. This tree was collected in 2013 just outside of Denver, Colorado in the Rocky Mountains. It's approximately 300 years old, and it was maintained for several years after collection in Denver at an elevation of about 1 mile. It was then brought to the southeast to Tennessee 1 year ago, so it's had one full growing season in a much more humid and hot environment. Over the course of this past growing season, this tree was heavily fertilized using organic fertilizer cakes and a combination of foliar feeding every other week. So over the course of a single growing season, it's put on about 25 to 30% more growth than it originally had when it came to the southeast only 1 year ago. In this particular case study, we're going to be doing some heavy bending in designing this tree. So leading up to this styling, we wanted to make sure that the tree was in good health. So that's why we fertilized it heavily, put it in good soil, maintained it well over this past growing season. And as you can see, it's in a state that it can be worked. This styling is going to be done in late fall, early winter before we get into the very deep cold. And this is a perfect time to do this kind of styling. Typically with a tree like this where we're going to be doing some heavy bending and some major changes to the tree, I recommend that you avoid doing this kind of work in the extreme temperatures of the year, meaning don't do it in the extreme heat of the summer and don't do it in the extreme cold of the winter. So this time of year, late fall going into early winter is a perfect time to do this, or late winter going into early spring is also a fantastic time to do this kind of work. Before we make any decisions about the design of this tree, I want to make sure that we clean up all of the live tissue, removing a lot of that bark so we can really expose the live vein and determine exactly which angle is going to be best based on the interplay of the live vein with the deadwood. So first things first, we're going to take a knife, clean off all of the flaky bark on the live tissue, delineate exactly where the live tissue and the deadwood intersect, and then we can determine which direction, which angle, and which front we're going to use for the design. So let's get into it. The first step in this process is to use a knife to remove all of the bark from the live tissue. You want to be very careful during this process so as not to damage the live tissue beneath the bark. Now, depending on the species, that bark may be very thick. In the case of Rocky Mountain junipers, the bark is notoriously thick and heavy over that live vein. So be very careful when using the knife so as not to tear too deeply and damage the live tissue beneath. As you're removing the bark, we want to start to delineate between the deadwood and the live vein. Now, how do we do that? The first way is visually. It should be somewhat easy to tell on an old tree like this where that live vein starts because that live vein will be swelling away from the deadwood, and there should be a small concave channel that runs between the live vein and the deadwood. This is your first indicator as to where the live vein begins and the deadwood ends. The second way to delineate between the deadwood and the live tissue is to use that same knife and very carefully scrape along the edge of the deadwood until you nick live tissue. You want to be very careful in this process not to nick too much of that live tissue because this can weaken the tree and potentially kill the plant. There should be a very obvious differentiation in color between the deadwood and the live tissue. So as you're scraping along that deadwood, it'll have a bit of a muted kind of yellowish color. As you nick that live tissue, it'll be a much brighter white color. Sometimes it will actually bleed as well. So it should be relatively easy to tell the difference between the deadwood and the live tissue scraping along with the knife. On an old tree like this, quite often there will be old bark on the deadwood that's very difficult to remove just using that knife. In those cases, I recommend that you buy this specialty tool, which is going to allow you to scrape that old bark much more easily than a knife will. The next step in the process is to use a Dremel tool with a sandpaper head and turn that up to a relatively high RPM. You'll want to run that along the deadwood right next to the live tissue to remove any remaining bark that was too difficult to remove with the scraping tool or the knife. The final step in the process is to use that same Dremel tool with the same sandpaper head, turn it down to a much lower RPM, and run it over the live vein itself. This is going to remove any inconsistencies in color. It'll turn the entire live vein a much brighter reddish color so you can really delineate between the deadwood and the live tissue. It's also more aesthetically pleasing in the very end when we paint the lime sulfur, which brings us to the very next step in the process. Now that the deadwood has been thoroughly cleaned, all of the debris has been washed away, and the bacteria has been completely removed, it is time to apply a substance called lime sulfur. Now, lime sulfur is actually a pesticide that's often used in Japan as a dormant spray. It kills any pests and potential diseases that could affect the trees over the course of the winter. It also is used to paint deadwood. It turns it a nice whitish color and it removes any bacteria. So what we're going to do is apply lime sulfur at a rate of 50% mixed with 50% water. So a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm going to apply it to all of the deadwood, and then we're going to go back over and touch up a few spots that we may have missed in the first application. I recommend doing the bark removal on junipers and applying lime sulfur at a minimum of once per year. Ideally, twice per year is better. It's going to allow you to remove the bark, expose any pests and diseases that might be hiding underneath that bark, and by painting the lime sulfur on the deadwood, it's also going to allow you to remove any bacteria or fungus that might cause rot. So typically twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall, is my recommendation for a yearly application of lime sulfur. Now that we've completed the process of cleaning the live vein, delineating the live vein from the deadwood, cleaning the deadwood, and painting the deadwood with lime sulfur, we can get into the meat and potatoes of this particular case study, which is the design process. The first step in this process is to identify both the flaws and the features of this tree. What I typically do is start at the base of the tree and work my way towards the top, identifying both the good points and the bad points of a given plant. So let's do that with this Rocky Mountain juniper. If you notice the base of the tree from this particular front, it's rather wide, and the tachiagari, which is the area just above the nabari or surface root area, up to basically the first portion of movement in the trunk, is situated on an angle moving to the left, which is quite nice. If this were on a perpendicular angle to the soil line, we would want to orient that one direction or the other, but because this tree naturally sits on a slight angle, that's a plus. Moving up the trunk into this area, you'll notice some very interesting deadwood features with beautiful striations. These are the type of features that we want to show off in the design. These tell the story of the tree, so potentially this could be a decent front for the plant because of this beautiful section right here. Moving further out the tree, you'll notice a nice twist in this area. You can actually see the live vein right here. It twists and then disappears slightly behind this deadwood feature, and then very slightly reappears at the base. So you can actually see it entering the soil here right at the very base of the tree. This is definitely a plus when you're deciding the front of a juniper, particularly an old yamadori like this. Ideally, you want to be able to see the live vein touch the soil. Now, why is this? If you can't see that live vein touching the soil, it's possible or quite likely that the tree might be a tanuki, which is basically a tree where you have a piece of deadwood and then a live tree attached to it, rather than a natural tree where the trunk has died over time and you're left with a natural live vein. So in order to really show that this is a natural tree and not a tanuki or a phoenix graft, we want to make sure to try to show off the live vein hitting the soil if possible. Now the issue with this particular front is that we had a live vein right here, or what appeared to be a live vein, before we got into the cleaning process. As we cleaned the tree though, we noticed that this area was in fact dead. So I had to remove all of the old bark from here, which gives us a very, very tiny visual of the actual living tissue right along the backside here. It would be more ideal to see more of that live vein from the front, so perhaps we can shift the front slightly one direction or the other to show that off a bit more. In the end, this may not actually happen. We may end up going with this particular front, but we need to keep all of these features and flaws in mind as we go. Now moving even further up the trunk, if you notice up at the top here, we have some beautiful deadwood features. These interplay very nicely from this particular angle here. You can see all three of those tengine or apical gins from this particular front. They move in a beautiful fashion together. They mimic one another, which is a great feature. So perhaps this is still a good front using this as an item to show off. Now if we go to the very far end of the trunk over here, you'll notice that this section is actually perpendicular, or nearly perpendicular to the ground. This typically would be considered a flaw. Just as I mentioned at the very beginning with the base of the tree, the tachiagari, we want to be on a slight angle. We also want to make sure that the rest of the trunk, all the way out to the very end, has no areas where they're parallel to the ground or perpendicular to the ground. So in this case, you'll notice here that that is almost perpendicular. So if we do use this as the front, perhaps we'll shift that slightly, or perhaps we'll try to bend that area to make it less perpendicular. Lastly, I want to take a look at the foliage relative to the features of the tree. If you notice, the foliage is way out here and all of the main features are way back here. So you've got sort of two disparate trees essentially. So what I want to do, if we do in fact use this as the front, is bring that foliage back down to interplay with the deadwood features here. The foliage is really used as a picture frame to frame the most interesting parts of the tree. So in order to do that, if we utilize this as the front, we'll have to put a major bend in that portion of the trunk to pull it down to create that picture frame to draw your eye to this most interesting feature of the tree. Now that we've discussed this particular front for the tree, let's shift the angle and the position of the tree to see if there might be a better front. I've shifted the tree about 45 degrees clockwise, and as you can see, there are some other interesting features that have been brought out, but there's also some flaws that have been exposed from this angle. So first off, let's start again at the base of the tree. If you notice, the width of the trunk is much narrower from this particular angle. It actually has a bit of reverse taper now as well, which is not ideal. However, as we move up the trunk into this area, the interplay of these three tengine is much more interesting from this particular front. So that's definitely a great feature. Now, one other thing that we need to consider again is, can we see the live vein touching the soil? Now, from this particular front, we can't see that. We've completely eliminated the visual of the live vein actually entering and touching the soil. So that's a major demerit using this as the front of the tree. Now, we brought out some interesting features in the middle of the tree here by shifting it on this angle. You'll notice the interplay of these two fine pieces of deadwood right here, and then this very straight piece that runs up through the middle. If we were to utilize this as the front of the tree, we would want to reduce some of this mass here running through the center of these two fine pieces. So I don't necessarily want to do that when I'm working with a tree like this, because anytime we work on the deadwood, whether that be with power tools or hand tools, you'll really always be able to tell that it's man-made. So because we have such beautiful striations here, I want to avoid actually tearing into that with hand tools. So all of these particular demerits, the narrowness of the base of the tree, the reverse taper of the trunk, the loss of the visual of the live vein entering the soil, and the potential of having to work on this deadwood section in the middle here to reduce that visual mass, I think all of those demerits or all of those flaws really take away from this being a good front for the tree. So let's shift the tree again, looking at the rear of the plant to see if there might be some interesting features that we can show off from that particular side. So this angle is the exact opposite 180-degree shift from the original front that we looked at. As you can see, there are some interesting characteristics brought out from this side, and again, there are some flaws that have been exposed. So first off, let's start at the base of the tree. You can see it's very wide, very powerful, and you can see the live vein actually enter the soil quite prominently here at the base. That's one great feature of this particular side. However, as we move up and out the tree here, you'll notice that this is very straight in this area. It does curve back down and then disappear around the back, which is a great feature. But this straightness through here, I don't find that interesting. So perhaps the other side might be a better front. Now, if you look at the base of the tree here where I removed some of that old bark with that scraping tool, you'll see that it looks man-made. It looks quite contrived. So I don't particularly want to show that off. Now, this will age quite nicely over time. However, for the time being, I don't think that it really merits using this as the front. The deadwood feature at the top up here, the interplay of the gins is quite nice, but probably not as good as the opposite side of the tree. And again, we're running into the issue of the perpendicular nature of this particular portion of the trunk here, which again isn't ideal. So perhaps if we did use this side, we would want to shift the angle one way or the other to get that on a slight angle off from perpendicular. Overall, I think that the opposite side of the tree is going to provide us a better front. So we're going to shift the tree back around and talk about potentially shifting the angle just slightly to bring out some of those better features, again, offsetting the perpendicular nature of this portion of the trunk. And then we can get into actually discussing the designing of the upper portion of the foliage mass. After assessing all the possible fronts and angles to use as the front of the tree, I've opted to go with our original front, but I've shifted the tree just slightly on an angle more towards the left. That's a very subtle change. It's only about 1/2 inch. However, what this does is it offsets this perpendicular portion of the trunk just slightly more, so it's on a little bit better angle. This will draw your eye away from that area once we set the foliage into position. And that brings us to the next step in the process, designing the foliage. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the main feature of the tree visually is down here. So in order to draw your eye to that, what I want to do is use the foliage to create kind of a picture frame down in this area to have that foliage interplay with the deadwood. The issue with this particular branch is that there's a piece of deadwood running up along the back side of it, which is making it very brittle, very stiff. So in order to move this branch, we're going to have to remove that strip of deadwood along the back side. So let's get into that particular technique. In order to remove the deadwood running along the back side of that large branch that we're going to bend, we need to utilize this specialty tool. It's a branch splitter. Take this tool and align it along the edge of the deadwood where it meets the live tissue. Slowly bite in along the deadwood, removing piece by piece until you've come to a point where you can't bite in any further with this particular tool. Once you reach a point where it becomes too difficult to bite any further into the branch with the branch splitter, it may be necessary to utilize a Dremel tool. Use a head on the Dremel tool that's going to allow you to bite deeply into that dead tissue and completely remove it. You want to be very careful during this process not to go too deeply and damage the live tissue beneath the deadwood. If you do in fact nick the live tissue, it's not the end of the world, but still be careful. If possible, we want to remove all or as close to all of that deadwood running down the backside of the live branch as possible. This is going to allow the branch to become much more flexible and pliable when we bend it. In the event that the branch is entirely alive, meaning that there's no deadwood running along it, it may be possible to remove some of that live branch itself. In these cases, I recommend that you avoid removing more than 30 to 40% of the total diameter of a branch. And of course, do not wedge a branch on a juniper because it won't heal properly. So very similar to what we've just done removing the deadwood, you'll want to take the same splitter tool, run along the live tissue down the length of the branch where you want it to become pliable, removing about 30 to 40% of that diameter. Now, of course, if you perform this technique, the tree needs to be in good health, and you need to be aware of the species that you're working with because some junipers respond better than others to this technique. Rocky Mountain juniper will respond relatively well to it. Shinpaku, Juniper chinensis from Japan, will respond relatively well to it. But Sabina juniper, for example, from Spain, do not like to have this technique performed to them. So in the case of Sabinas, you're much better off just trying to bend the entire branch without removing any portion of the diameter of a live branch. Or if you have a branch like this where you have deadwood running along the backside, it's okay to remove that deadwood to make the branch more pliable in order to bend it. Once all of the deadwood has been removed from the backside of the branch, it's then necessary to create a backbone of wire running along the length of that branch. In the case of this particular branch, we removed a lot of deadwood very deeply into the branch itself, which means we now have a concave channel running along the backside. In order to prevent the branch from cracking or snapping as we bend it, we want to fill that entire space in with a backbone of wire. In the case of this tree, we utilized copper wire. However, you can also use aluminum wire for the same purpose. As you can see, if you run your finger over the copper wire, it's actually filled the entire space in and made the branch feel as if it's whole again. The main purpose in utilizing a backbone of wire down the backside of a branch is to prevent that branch from snapping when we bend it. If the branch doesn't have that copper wire backbone or an aluminum wire backbone, it's very likely to bend on a sharp angle and snap when we try to do that major bend later in this process. Following the insertion of the wire backbone, we then apply raffia around the branch as an added protective layer. Let's discuss the preparation process for raffia. In order to bend a branch of this caliber on a juniper, we need to utilize something called raffia as an extra layer of protection around the bark when bending that branch. Raffia is a grass or a reed, and you can buy it at any local hobby shop or craft store. In the case of this particular tree, the branch is about 1.5 inches in diameter. So the number of strands that we want to tie together is going to be between 12 and 15. So what we do is pull the strands out. The raffia is dry at this point. We pull the strands out and tie the thinner end together. That way it gets progressively fatter as we get towards the end of the raffia at the base. What I'm going to do here is just loop this around, tie those thinner ends together, and pull them nice and tight. Later, when we actually apply this to the tree, we're going to cut this off so it looks a little bit cleaner. But for the time being, this is perfect. What I'll do now is wrap it very lightly around my hand, loop it around itself, which locks these into place. And then I'm going to put this into a jar or a bucket of water. I'm going to let it soak for a couple of hours so it gets nice and saturated, and then we can actually apply this to the tree. When applying raffia to a branch, the directionality of the raffia, meaning does it go clockwise or counterclockwise, is very important. Well, how do we determine which direction that raffia should go? Well, first we need to jump one step ahead and think about the directionality of the wrapped wire that we're going to be subsequently applying to that branch. The directionality of that wire and the directionality of the raffia will be the same direction, so we want to make sure that we're applying it properly. Now, how do we decide which direction the wire should go? Well, for those of you who have participated in our online intermediate course, you'll know that as you wire a branch, when you come to the end of the branch, we always loop the wire underneath. So it's going one direction or the other. Whatever direction the end of that wire is pointing, think of that as an arrow indicating which direction you can bend the branch and twist it, and that wire will then tighten as you go. So for example, if we're wiring clockwise, that wire is going to be pointing to the left. That means you can take a branch and bend it to the left and the wire will tighten. If you wire anti-clockwise or counterclockwise, that wire is then going to be pointing to the right, which means you can bend the branch to the right. For me, this is an easy way to keep track of which direction I should be applying the wire and also the raffia. And that brings us back to the raffia discussion. And with this particular branch, we're going to be pulling it down and towards the rear, which means back towards the right, looking at the tree from the side here. That means that the raffia and the subsequent wrapped wire both need to go counterclockwise. In order to apply the raffia, what we want to do is find a branch or a gin around which we can split the raffia and attach it tightly. So that's what we've done with this large branch here. There is a gin at the very base of that branch that we've split the raffia around, and that's serving as our anchor point and starting point for that raffia. As you wrap the raffia, be sure to pull tightly and overlap by about half on each turn. As you're applying the raffia, there will inevitably come a time where that first group of raffia runs out, and you'll need to attach a second group of raffia to continue out on the same branch. Now, how do you do that? As you get to the end of the first group of raffia, take a second group of raffia, lay the knotted end under the loose ends of the original group of raffia, wrap that around, twist it together, and then continue to wrap that further out on the branch. This will lock that second group of raffia into place. And at the very end of this process, we can go back with scissors and remove each of those individual knots that look messy along the length of the branch. This will give you a nice consistent look to the raffia from beginning to end along the entirety of the branch. When we've gone far enough out on the branch with the raffia and it's time to tie that raffia off, there's several ways to do this. In the case of this particular tree, we had that backbone of wire running down the length of the branch. At the very end, it's sticking out just slightly, so we're going to use that as a point at which to tie off the raffia. So just like we started at the base of the branch where we split the raffia around a gin and that was our anchor point, we're going to use that wire that's sticking out at the end of the branch as a tie-off point. So split the raffia around that, double knot it, pull it nice and tight, and then cut those strands off, and that should lock the raffia in. Now that the raffia and the wire have been applied to the main branches, it's time to get into the pruning and the wiring of the rest of the tree. Depending on the species of juniper, we can remove more or less foliage to the detriment or the benefit of the tree. So in the case of Rocky Mountain junipers, they don't particularly like to have a lot of foliage removed all at once. So I tend to leave a bit more foliage on them than I would with, say, a Kishu Shinpaku juniper or other Junipers chinensis. The reason that I don't want to remove too much foliage all at once on a Rocky Mountain juniper is because it stresses the tree out. The tree is likely to produce massive amounts of juvenile foliage in the subsequent growing season. This is an evolutionary response in the tree, so if this tree were in the mountains and an animal came along, nibbled a lot of the foliage off, it would then put out juvenile foliage, which is much more spiky and much less desirable to those animals, so they're much less likely to come back and eat the same plant if it's covered with juvenile foliage. I want to avoid causing a lot of juvenile foliage to appear on this tree next growing season, so I'm actually going to leave more branching on the tree than we'll eventually need. As I style the tree and as the tree develops over the next couple of years, little by little I'll remove more and more foliage or more branches that are unnecessary to the design. But for right now, we're going to wire essentially everything on the tree, removing only the absolutely unnecessary foliage for the time being. So again, for those of you who have participated in our online beginner or intermediate courses, you'll know that the types of growth that we're looking to remove are going to be the crotch growth, so anything growing out of the crotches of our branches, any branches that are long and leggy with just a little tuft of foliage at the end, because those are really unusable in the design. Any branches that are sticking straight up or straight down out of our lateral branches, and any fluff that's hanging off the bottom of our lateral branches. This will clean up the tree to a degree where I can see the structure and apply the wire more easily, but it won't remove too much foliage and cause juvenile growth to appear next year. As you can see at this stage in the process, the tree has been fully wired. Now the next step is to set the branches into place and start to design the overall concept of the tree. Now with this particular tree, I do have an image in my head as to how it's going to turn out in the very end. Although as I get into the process of setting the branches, this might shift slightly one direction or the other. But in general, I do know that because we're going to be pulling that upper portion of the trunk down and to the rear, this upper portion here that's now the apex will actually end up as a back branch here for depth to the design. This branch here that's cutting across the front, I'm going to have to manipulate that back and around, and it's going to end up as our first directional branch just underneath the trunk right here. As I pull the upper section of the trunk down, this branch right here will be manipulated back around to be the new apex. Now this may shift a little, as I said, during the design process, but as a general rule of thumb, this is sort of how I go about the process of designing a tree. So I do know, in general, where each of those branches is going to end up. It's the details that might change along the way. Now this brings us to the first step in this process of design, bending that big portion of the upper trunk.